A bright light burned into Ann Petrov's eyes. He winced in slight pain as his pupils contracted to balance out the light with the rest of... Where was he? The question raced through his mind as his eyes darted in all directions, trying to make out any details to indicate any clue as to where he was. But all he could see was darkness, except for the light fixture hanging above him. He could feel his heart pulsing in his chest as he tried to sit up, realizing that his wrists and ankles were tied down to what seemed like was a recliner. He kicked down his legs, causing the chair to revert to its normal sitting position, bringing into view a small coffee table and an antique wooden chair that sat across from him, barely visible in the dim light from above. There was a small glass of water on the table and a small black orb next to it. "You must be thirsty," a voice said from the darkness. Anne looked up in the direction the voice was coming from. It was a familiar voice. The rush of memories flooding back into his mind temporarily disoriented, causing a slight sense of nausea. The last thing he remembered was getting out of his Uber and walking up to his hotel room door before hearing a voice screaming at him and then blacking out after being sucker punched. He wanted to know where he was. He wanted to know who the voice belonged to, but as he went to speak, a sharp pain shot through his jaw. He painfully moaned as the voice spoke again. "Hey now, take it easy. I don't think it's broken, but he did hit you pretty hard." The figure of a female slipped out of the shadows from behind the wooden chair. Ian noticed that her outfit was civilian in nature. He knew whoever she was a professional, and he began to wonder if his life was in danger. Was this woman going to kill him? She sat down and pulled a straw out of her high-cut jean jacket pocket. She smiled, unwrapped it, and placed it into the glass as she held it up to Anne's mouth. "Listen, first off, I just want to say sorry. Maybe getting that brute to lay you out on the account you were an abusive boyfriend was a little much. But hey, here we are. And I was pretty sure if I just walked up to you and started grilling you on Project G.I.G.A.N, you weren't going to be as cooperative." Ian stopped drinking. He was not expecting that statement. How did she know about Project G.I.G.A.N? Now all was clear. This is why he was here, and this is why he was still alive. "Who are you?" "My name is Macy. And don't worry, I'm not going to kill you. However, I want you to know that I did slip a little truth serum cocktail into the water. It'll take effect momentarily. So in the meantime, you're probably wondering how I know about Project G.I.G.A.N, the Godzilla Intelligence Global Assault Network. You can find out just about anything you want on the dark web these days. So I'll tell you what I know, and you can fill in the gaps. Then after that, you can go, and I'll never bother you again. Deal?" Ian began to feel the serum working on him. He struggled to keep his wits about him. "Your name is Ann Petrov. Your father was from Russia, and your mother was from the States. They met and settled down in Canada, where they had you and your little sister Ava. After she passed away from cancer, you went on to graduate university with a degree in biomechanical engineering, dedicating your life to finding a cure. You began working on integrating nerve and tissue with robotics. Interesting that I couldn't find out anything on who your investor was, except a Russian bank that the funds were transferred from. You were on the verge of a breakthrough when the San Francisco event happened, and then you disappeared for 2 years into Russia. Now you've been back for a year and haven't touched anything to do with your degree. Hell, you work in a pet store. So here's where you fill in the blanks." Ian was impressed with how much she already knew about him, but not once did she mention Project G.I.G.A.N. He gestured for another drink of the water. Why not? He already felt the compound working, making him feel more eager to fill in the gaps. Might as well quench his thirst if he was going to be forced to break the oath he swore to the Russian government. That probably meant the end of his life. But after knowing what he knew, he didn't care anymore. He swallowed one more sip and sat back in the recliner. This world doesn't belong to us. It never did. We were left to care for it while they slept. But what did we do? We destroyed it. We pillaged its resources, warred over its lands, and killed the very life it created. And now they have returned to take it back. And I'm not so sure they're going to be happy with what we've done. Macy sat back, crossing her arms and legs. What is Project G.I.G.A.N? Project G.I.G.A.N was initiated after the creatures made their appearance in Hawaii back in 2014. The project's purpose was to gather intelligence on possible ways to defend against Godzilla should he threaten the Russian territories. Ever since the 1970s, the Russians have been gathering information from sources all over the world. They knew the Americans had found Skull Island and knew about these creatures as well. The whole Cold War was a cover-up for what was really going on. The Russians knew about the secret agency Monarch too. And they thought they were being super secret. But realizing that bringing the existence of these ancient creatures to the public would only cause mass hysteria, the Russian government decided to address the issue by other means. All of their satellites, all of their military outposts around the world, their advances in military technology and science, all of it for one reason: to prepare for these creatures coming. With the internet in its current state, it was easy for them to gather intel. They were even able to get their hands on some samples of Godzilla's tissues from Ground Zero. And then they recruited me to help them develop anti-Godzilla countermeasures. Macy nodded her head with a smile. So they're just piggybacking off of Monarch then? Ian shifted in his restraints as he shook his head in response to Macy's question. Not exactly. After the Battle of San Francisco, the Russians hacked into Monarch's network and took command of the satellites they were using to track Godzilla. After he disappeared into the Pacific, they ran a continuous loop of misinformation on Godzilla's current location. The next time Godzilla would actually appear would be 3 weeks later. He appeared at Chelyabinsk and made his way to Chernobyl. Naturally, the Russian government suppressed any information about Godzilla landing in Russia. Nothing for the media, nothing for the internet. He spent a few days deep inside the radiation zones, though. They assumed he was feeding off the high levels of radiation after his battle. And when he was finally finished, they had noticed that all of his wounds had completely healed. Then he headed back to Chelyabinsk and vanished. Macy leaned forward, letting her curiosity shine through her facial expressions. She raised the half-empty glass, gesturing for Ian to take another drink as she continued her interrogation. How did Godzilla just vanish? Does he have some sort of active camo we didn't know about? Ian chuckled as he struggled to swallow his mouth full of water without choking. Ha! Thank God he doesn't have that, or we'd never find him. No, apparently the meteor that fell in 2013 opened up an access point to one of those underground passageways like those found on Skull Island. But that's not all the meteor brought with it. The official reports state that it was a small meteor, but in fact it wasn't much smaller than Godzilla himself. But what was inside was even bigger. Ian jerked with excitement. Then he looked down at his restraints and made a sad face. He turned to Macy with the most pitiful look he could muster. Can we get rid of these? They're really starting to hurt. Macy couldn't help but chuckle a little as she sat back in the wooden antique chair. Only after you tell me what was in the meteor. Ian smiled as the truth serum was now in full effect, throwing away his inhibitions. Monsters don't exist on just this planet. The whole reason the Russians recruited me for Project G.I.G.A.N was because of what they found. A perfectly preserved corpse of a creature not of this world. Of course, it wasn't complete. Most of its body had been what seemed like mangled or torn apart or whatever. Its forearms were missing, and so were parts of its other appendages and pieces of its body. but its skeletal structure was still intact for the most part, and even some of its tissue had survived frozen. Its DNA was unlike anything on Earth. After I began to study its properties and structure, I found that it had the ability to assimilate inorganic material into its DNA sequence. The mandate of the project changed after this discovery. They wanted a deterrent should Godzilla or any other monster make landfall on Russian soil. They wanted a weapon. And my mind changed. Instead of looking for a cure, I dedicated myself to stopping these monsters. My logic was simple. If we couldn't stop Godzilla, then there wouldn't be a world to find a cure for. My colleagues started calling me Frankenstein. I spent months building their weapon. I guess it would be better to call it a monster. I didn't even get to name it. They decided to simply call it G.I.G.A.N. Macy glanced down at the black metallic orb sitting next to the glass. Was it time to use it? She wondered to herself. The glass was only half empty, but the serum seemed to be working to full effect. Still, she needed him to be relaxed, to trust her. She still had a lot of questions, and it would be easier to gather this information if her captive was cooperative. She reached down to the glass once more. Wait, they didn't let you name it? Those jerks. Ian smiled as he took another drink while Macy held the glass for him. Well, a deal's a deal, Macy said while she placed the now empty glass on the table. Then she got up and walked over to Ian, who was pushed back deep into his recliner, fearing what his captor was about to do to him. She loosened the restraints around his wrists until they were completely off. She smiled at Ian. Then, with her eyes, she gestured down to her waist. Ian followed her gaze and noticed she had a gun tucked into the rim of her jeans. I already told you I wasn't going to kill you, and you did answer my question. But no funny business, okay? Ian gave her a look of relief and nodded his head in compliance. Macy took her seat in the wooden chair again as Ian looked deep into her eyes. He was still puzzled at the brilliant blue that hued her iris. How was she connected to all of this, he wondered. Just some random girl who knew things the rest of the world is still in the dark about? Who was she? You said your colleagues called you Frankenstein. Why would they call you that? Come on, you're telling me you don't know the story of Dr. Victor Frankenstein? Macy chuckled as she gave Ian a look of disamusement. Heh. Well, in the story, the good doctor creates life by sewing together a human being and blasting it with lightning. It was one of my favorite books. And that was me, more or less. After initial tests on tissue samples, we found that it reacted with nuclear radiation in a most curious manner. It increased its rate of assimilation. It took me months, but I finally cracked the code, and with careful genetic manipulation, and of course filling in the gaps of the genetic code with DNA from the Godzilla cells, I was able to fuse a small robotic arm with a sample of the alien tissue. It was a glorious day. Too bad I would never win the Nobel Prize. It was only months after that we started to build the rest of G.I.G.A.N. Of course, the Russians wanted a luxury model, so we added some weapon systems. We knew conventional weapons wouldn't work, so we had to think outside the box. We outfitted his forearms with a lightweight titanium scythe-like sickles, and we did the same to its feet as well as other missing parts. Above its optics unit, we embedded a new electromagnetic projectile weapon that the Russians had been working on. But the best part was its brain. The first ever semi-organic AI-controlled brain complete with cybernetic enhancements, allowing it access to any system it needed to gather intel and form strategies in real time to combat Godzilla. I still remember its first battle. Ian inhaled deep and exhaled with a wide grin across his face as he sat back in his recliner. You can still remember it? Like it happened yesterday. I felt like a proud parent, you know. Macy leaned forward and picked up the small metallic orb that sat next to the empty glass. Holding it in one hand, she began to caress it with her other hand as she sat back in her chair. Ian was puzzled at the small black object. What was it? I'm glad. I'd like to see it for myself. Huh, I wish you could have. It was such an awesome sight to... Ian's words disappeared into his throat as his attention was taken by a bright light shining through small cracks that began to open up all over the orb's surface as his breath was taken away by its beauty. The light began to intensify rapidly as it covered Macy completely, and soon Ian realized that he was completely covered in its light as well. It's the same color as her eyes. The thought raced through his mind as the light overtook him. And then, in the blink of an eye, he found himself at the observation post where he had witnessed the titanic battle between his creation and Godzilla. But how? He looked around, observing his surroundings. He could see his colleagues and other Project G.I.G.A.N personnel shuffling around their instruments. And in the distance, he could see the floodlights that had been positioned around the crater leading to the underground passageway Godzilla had been using. I know you may have questions, but I need you to focus. This is a simulation and it'll show us your memories. Everything and everyone here is a memory and can't hurt you, so whatever happens, remember, you're safe. Ian looked over to his left to find Macy standing next to him. Her eyes were a brilliant shade of neon blue now, practically glowing. His head swelled with questions, but he felt compelled to do as Macy had suggested. He turned his gaze back to the site, which would soon become a battleground. The sky was pitch black, illuminated by the light of the full moon and the blanket of stars, which seemed to never end. The breeze was cold, just like he remembered. Then, off in the distance, the sound of propellers beating in the wind grabbed his attention. He watched as Gigan came into view, hovering over the massive entryway, his body suspended by massive tow cables attached to half-dozen Osprey aircraft. I remember how tense everyone was. We all were wondering what the outcome would be. We calculated a 72% chance of success, but that was a large margin of error. Still, I was hopeful. I didn't just create a weapon, you know. I created a whole new life form, and it was magnificent. Ian's statement was cut short when the pair heard the ever-familiar sound of the ancient god approaching. We registered slight seismic activity as Godzilla approached. Our predictions were right, and the beast had come, and we were ready. I remember watching as the floodlights simultaneously flickered out as to not alert Godzilla to our presence. Gigan had crouched low on all fours as if it was a lion ready to pounce on its prey. I remember wondering just how much information had it accessed. Its movements were very animalistic in character. Had it developed a new subroutine in its programs? I was beside myself in awe with what I had created. And then he appeared. Godzilla broke the threshold of the hole in the ground, letting out a massive roar. Macy thought to herself, that's his warning, as she watched Godzilla pull himself to his feet just outside the crater, the moon's light highlighting the unique patterns in his maple leaf-like dorsal plates. The giant took a step forward and began to sniff the air. Macy could see that Godzilla sensed something was not right. Then suddenly, the floodlights flashed on, blinding the behemoth temporarily. Macy could hear Godzilla cry out in confusion as Ian began to speak. This was it. This was the moment G.I.G.A.N would show the whole world that it truly was alive. Macy's attention was pulled away from her captive as G.I.G.A.N let out an unearthly cry before leaping at the flank of the still disoriented Godzilla. Macy watched as G.I.G.A.N's sickle-like forearms buried themselves into Godzilla's shoulder and thigh, a red ichor gushing from each puncture site. Godzilla roared in pain as G.I.G.A.N used its forward momentum to push itself up and over the behemoth, twisting its grip and pulling Godzilla down on its other side with a thunderous boom. The cyborg then ripped its claws away from Godzilla's hide as it let out a menacing alien roar. Macy felt her heart sink into her stomach. Surprising herself, she began to wonder if Project G.I.G.A.N would succeed. Could this weapon actually kill Godzilla? She watched as G.I.G.A.N loomed over the wounded god. Godzilla swung his head around, finally getting a clear view of his assailant. And in the same moment he realized G.I.G.A.N was bringing his claws down to strike the death blow. The giant quickly rolled out of the way as G.I.G.A.N's sickle-like claws came crashing down, heaving up dust and snow. Macy had noticed the heavy snowfall as she watched Godzilla, still on the ground, swing his thick tail around, knocking G.I.G.A.N off balance, causing the mechanical alien to crash to the ground head first. A brilliant blue light filled the area when the dorsal plates running up Godzilla's spine had begun to glow as it made its way to its feet. G.I.G.A.N shrieked at Godzilla as it scrambled to defend itself from the oncoming attack. Godzilla's atomic breath met the sickle-like claws as G.I.G.A.N attempted to defend itself by throwing its arms up in a defensive stance. Macy noticed the movements were now more human-like as it struggled to keep the attack at bay and regain its footing. Snow began to melt around the two monsters as the atomic breath began to overheat the titanium arms of the otherworldly cyborg. G.I.G.A.N cried out in pain as it swung its tail, giving it enough momentum to leap out of the way from the beam as it crashed into the snow-covered ground below. Macy noticed how one of its sickle-like arms was severely damaged by its melted appearance. Suddenly, a flash of light appeared just above G.I.G.A.N's head, followed by a loud sonic boom. In the same breath, Macy watched as Godzilla flew backwards as if it were struck by an enormous battering ram. Cries of pain could be heard for miles as Godzilla rolled to a stop. Dust clouds and kicked-up snow added to the already low visibility caused by the blizzard that was now in full effect. Godzilla struggled to his feet when it heard another sonic boom. Not even a second later, and Godzilla fell to the ground, the wind knocked out of him. Macy watched as a distressed Godzilla flailed around on the ground, clawing at its chest where the projectile had hit. G.I.G.A.N let out a roar as it closed the distance between it and its prey. Macy noticed that one of its mandibles had been chipped away, causing the already alien-looking creature to look even more menacing. Moments later, it was hovering over the beaten god. It slammed one foot onto Godzilla's chest and roared with a triumphant metallic cry. Suddenly, it felt itself lose its balance as Godzilla twisted its leg at the knee and rolled. G.I.G.A.N came crashing down over top Godzilla in a cacophony of roars and cries. Now Godzilla was straddling the technological abomination, one leg on each arm. Macy noticed Godzilla had also managed to completely snap the leg in half, breaking it at the knee. Godzilla, growling, stared deep into the singular red eye that made up G.I.G.A.N's optical sensor. Suddenly, dust and snow exploded upwards in a reverse mushroom cloud, following a flash of light and a sonic boom. Macy waited as the smoke and dust began to settle. She heard Gigan cry out, and then suddenly it was silenced by another loud explosion. All Macy could see was an eerie blue light through the dust and snow. She heard Godzilla cry out as Ian began to speak. They say it's always hard to see your children fail. We didn't know Godzilla's ability to generate nuclear pulses, so we couldn't hold it against him. But we all felt the sting of the defeat, but none more so than my precious Gigan. Macy turned to face Ian, noticing tears running down the side of his face. But remember what they teach you in school when you're a kid and you fail? You just gotta get up and try again. Macy took a deep breath as the cool ocean breeze caressed her skin. She could feel the waves breaking on her legs while the sound of seabirds flew overhead. She could hear the dense jungle beyond the beach swaying in the wind. For a moment she felt relaxed, as if everything was right with the world. Unfortunately, the reality was that she was in a simulation. Everything that touched her 5 senses was all just in her mind. But in this moment, as she looked out over the sea in front of her, everything was right with the world. Suddenly, a voice crept into her mind. "Hello again, Dr. Jensen." Macy turned around to find Nima smiling at her. The philologist returned the expression, but with a hint of curiosity. "Hello, Nima. I have some questions for you." "Understood. I must remind you, however, that I was not programmed to answer most of your questions, as I am simply a messenger." "Yeah, okay. But let's try anyway. Can you translate vision the same way you translate what we're saying?" "If you are asking if I can translate our written language to your written language, then the answer is yes." "Wonderful. Take us to the laboratory you created Biollante in, would you?" Nima smiled at Macy. Then in the blink of an eye, they were in Nima's laboratory where she had created the abomination that doomed her people. Nima watched as Macy walked around the room looking for anything with writing on it. When Macy reached what she assumed was Nima's desk, she felt Nima's voice flow into her mind. "Initiating translation protocols. It will only be a moment before the translation process is completed." Macy glanced back at Nima and smiled before resuming her search. And that's when she found it. A tomb with the simple title, "Before the Gods." She could feel her pulse rising with excitement as she reached down to pick up the tomb. But to her dismay, she could not. Every time she tried, her hand just passed through it as if it wasn't there. "Apologies, Dr. Jensen. You cannot manipulate the data stored within the simulation." Macy crossed her arms in frustration. Then a new question came to her mind as she turned to ask Nima. "Can you tell me what the contents of this tomb is?" "All I can tell you is that the tomb tells the story of how the Titans shaped our world and how they protected it from the heavens before their children defeated them and began their reign." "Elaborate, please. What do you mean, how they protected the world from the heavens?" Macy watched as Nima's head began to jerk, as if she was following a small insect's flight path. Then suddenly she stopped and stared at Macy. "Apologies, Dr. Jensen, but there appears to be no more data on this subject. Are there any more queries?" Macy looked down for a moment, lost in thought. With a new question on the edge of her mind, she approached the avatar of Nima. "Is it possible to add data to the cephalon?" "Yes, it is. To add data, all one must do is freely share a memory or memories." "What do you mean by freely?" "In accordance with one's will. The cephalon cannot forcibly extract memories as a precaution, so as to not be used as a weapon. Macy smiled at Nima. She glanced around the room one last time, making sure she did not miss anything. Satisfied, she turned back to Nima. All right, Nima, I'll be going now. I have work to do, but I'll be seeing you soon. Goodbye, Dr. Jensen. Even though they were miles away, Godzilla's roar blared through the ensuing blizzard with such velocity, Macy felt as if he was right in front of her. Her attention was drawn away from the behemoth as the dust and snow settled around him. Ian was wiping the last of the tears from his face as he turned to Macy. It seemed the odds favored Godzilla this time, but the encounter gave us all we needed to defeat him. We also learned in the following weeks that Godzilla had been frequenting the Chernobyl disaster site. He would stay there for days at Ground Zero, feeding off the radiation. We also learned that the radiation levels had been dropping rapidly, lower than they had ever been. We soon realized that Godzilla would consume all the radiation from Chernobyl, and we estimated we only had 6 days left before it was all gone and we would miss our chance to finish him once and for all. Macy watched as the observation post blinked into a new location. She looked around to get her bearings, and her initial conclusion was that she was now in a massive hangar. She watched as men and women in coveralls meticulously checked equipment and sensors. Then her gaze fell on a launch pad with G.I.G.A.N suspended from cables, its whole front side completely blown away. She noticed its arms were not attached, but dangling from cables of their own to either side of the cyborg. Atomic breath was not the only weapon Godzilla had in its arsenal. This was caused by a massive burst of radiation that was so intense it melted away the flesh and most of the titanium that comprised G.I.G.A.N's anterior section. However, the skeletal structure we coated with titanium as well was almost completely intact, allowing us a jump start on upgrades. Macy blinked again, now finding herself in front of an almost completely new monster. G.I.G.A.N was more metallic in his appearance than in his previous incarnation. It still retained the cycloptic eye it had from before. Serrated teeth still lined the inside of its beak, and the mandibles had been rebuilt to look more menacing. A truly alien creature to Earth, she thought to herself. She also noticed the arms had been reattached, but they were more sword-like than the sickles they once were. The dorsal fins had also been reconstructed and were now the same color red as his optical unit. She took note of what looked like a chainsaw that ran from the top of its chest down to the lower abdomen. G.I.G.A.N, now almost completely covered in metal armor plating, was more machine than creature. Is that a buzzsaw? Ian smiled with a look of pride on his face. Do you like it? We added a few other weapon systems and reinforced its close combat weapons with a diamond coating to mitigate the damage caused by his radioactive blast. All they wanted was a weapon, and I gave him one, and so much more. Macy gave him a curious glance, showing him her more than obvious interest. All the organic material on the outside had all but been destroyed, but there was some that lingered on the inside. It had fused itself with the neural systems of the AI brain we had installed. It seemed like this gave the AI its own personality, truly making it a sentient creature. Of course, it had pre-programmed subroutines and protocols, but what the Russians didn't realize was that it was collecting its own data, and not just on Godzilla. It used the network to pull anything it could find off the internet to give it an edge. I monitored all of its activity as we drew closer to the confrontation. Macy observed Ian as he looked up in the direction of Gigan's head. It seemed as if he was communicating with his cybernetic creation. The image of Ian looking at Gigan as a father would look at their child was all Macy needed to see to realize just how off the rails Ian had gone while working on Project G.I.G.A.N. All they wanted was a weapon to kill Godzilla. But Gigan was so much more than just a tool. It had a soul. It was truly alive. Gigan cried out as it shifted in its restraints. Macy watched as Ian cautiously walked over to the launch pad with one of his arms raised. Personnel from the project all rushed to their closest exits while yelling at Ian to join them. She noticed a smile on his face as he began to speak. This is probably the closest I'll ever get to being a father. I began to resent the Russians, though. G.I.G.A.N was more than just any weapon. It was a living creature, part instinct, part instruction. It was clear that it wanted freedom. But the Russians wouldn't have it. Ian lowered his hand as G.I.G.A.N slowly stopped its erratic attempts at freeing itself. It stared directly at Macy's captive as he stared back. What just happened, Ian? What did you do to make him stop? Turns out G.I.G.A.N imprinted on me. Maybe now you'll understand our connection. Ian returned to Macy as the giant cyborg lowered its head, the glow from its eye fading out as its power system shut down. Macy wondered how this was possible as she stared at Ian with a perplexed look. I know it's crazy. My best guess is that it managed to extract data on who its creator was. My only regret was that I couldn't take this opportunity to try to communicate with it. Our window to finish off Godzilla was quickly closing. My only hope was that Godzilla didn't have any other tricks up his sleeve. Macy blinked her glowing blue eyes only to find her location had changed to what seemed like another outpost when she opened them. There was a large monitor surrounded by several smaller monitors with a few personnel tinkering with the controls on the consoles beneath in front of her. The wind was blowing and there was a slight snowfall. She took note of the encroaching clouds overhead, the sun's light breaking through but only just. On the monitors were images of Godzilla from different viewpoints. Ian's voice caught her attention even though she kept her eyes on the screens. With the improvements to Gigan's weapon systems and his increased intelligence, I calculated the probability of success at 0.9285. We did not have a viable answer to Godzilla's nuclear pulse other than the AI being able to predict it in time to minimize the danger, and this was just one of 3 outposts set up around Godzilla's position within the Chernobyl site. One to the west, one to the north, and one to the east. We're at the western outpost. He was resting in the courtyards. I guess he wasn't too bothered by our drones watching him. Macy could hear the sounds of the aircraft that carried G.I.G.A.N off in the distance drawing ever closer. On the screens, she watched as Godzilla's eyes opened and looked around as the behemoth made its way to its feet. He roared at the ospreys carrying the alien abomination. You know, I had planned on helping G.I.G.A.N after the battle. I could only imagine what its mind had discovered and processed. All the things it learned, all the questions it still had waiting to be heard. These people just wanted a weapon, but G.I.G.A.N wanted freedom. He needed freedom. Isn't that the right of all living beings? Macy's attention was stolen by her captive as he gestured for her to come with him as he moved to the edge of the observation post. This is the best seat in the house. Gigan's cycloptic eye began to glow a menacing red as its systems came online. It raised its head to see Godzilla in the distance below him. It let out a cry as it began to twist and turn, trying to break free of its restraints. Godzilla bellowed out another roar as he began to charge at his cybernetically enhanced opponent as it fell after causing the aircraft carrying it to collide with one another. Godzilla, now at full speed, slammed into the alien construct just before it made landfall. The two giants fell to the ground, rolling over top one another before coming to a stop. Godzilla picked itself up and shook off the dust and debris that had collected itself on the god's hide. G.I.G.A.N, still disoriented, started to make its way to its feet when it felt the rough skin and nails of Godzilla's forearms slamming down on its shoulders in a tight grip. Macy watched Godzilla's dorsal plates light up the clouds above in a brilliant shade of blue as the sun's light began to fade into night. Suddenly, the brilliant blue light flickered out as Godzilla cried out in pain. The behemoth looked down to see one of G.I.G.A.N's sword-like scythe buried deep into the side of its lower abdomen. Suddenly, the beast felt another stabbing pain run through its shoulder on the opposite side. The ancient god cried out in pain as G.I.G.A.N used its body as leverage to pull itself onto its feet. Macy turned her attention to the monitors to get a better view. She could see Godzilla's blood flowing down G.I.G.A.N's enhanced weapons that were buried deep into its thick hide. Macy felt her stomach turn as G.I.G.A.N pulled Godzilla in closer to itself as the chainsaw-like weapon it now possessed switched on. Godzilla cried out in pain as the blade slashed and cut deeply into the giant's chest and stomach, blood splattering all over the cyborg's front, side, and beak. It let out a cry to match Godzilla's own. Macy's heart sank into her chest as Godzilla fell limp into the mechanical monster. The sun's light finally fading behind the storm clouds as the wind and snow began to pick up. Macy noticed a blinking light on the console below the screens. It was a miniature map of the battlefield showing the Chernobyl plant and the surrounding outposts. The icon indicating the easternmost post was flashing red. Macy glanced at Ian, who was shaking his head before her attention was taken back to the edge of what roofed the observation post. Something was in the clouds above the two titans. Macy glanced back at the monitors to see if the drones had picked up a better view when she noticed all of their screens were only showing static. That's when she heard the sound of something she had never heard before. It was majestic, yet fierce. G.I.G.A.N looked up and cried out, the clouds opening up by massive gusts of wind, as it was blinded by the intense light that was revealed. We had him beat. Victory was ours. But then it was stolen away from my precious G.I.G.A.N. My heart is breaking all over again, but I will enjoy watching what comes next. The bright light illuminated the entire battlefield as it began to descend. G.I.G.A.N did everything it could to shield its glowing red eye, but its arms were still buried in Godzilla, who was unconscious. Massive gusts of wind pushed snow and dust up into the air as Macy could start to see the outline of a pair of wings. Then, with unnatural speed, the illuminated being dove down to the two titans, its light fading away to reveal the creature that caused it. Macy was shocked at the creature's appearance. It was actually quite small if you didn't account for the massive wingspan when compared to the other two behemoths below it. The only way Macy could describe it was that it looked like a giant butterfly or a moth. She watched as the creature swooped down, clawing at G.I.G.A.N's head with its outstretched, hooked claws. G.I.G.A.N shrieked as the creature attempted to separate the two titans by pulling the cyborg's head backwards. Its sword-like scythe ripped out of Godzilla's hide as the beast fell to the ground still unconscious. G.I.G.A.N caught itself as it fell to the ground after the moth-like creature released its grip. Its vision finally returning, G.I.G.A.N rose to its feet to face this new threat when it saw the two massive eyes that belonged to Godzilla staring at him. The cyborg took a step back in confusion as it realized it was only looking at the wings of its true assailant. Lightning flashed across the darkened clouds as the giant insect let out another cry, hovering in place. G.I.G.A.N felt itself being pushed back by the hurricane winds produced by its new opponent as it struggled to keep its footing. The cyborg cried out as a flash of light appeared above its eye, followed by a sonic boom. Macy watched the majestic creature fall to the ground with cries of pain from the massive hole that now appeared in the lower part of its right wing. The creature struggled onto its feet, its wings folding up and down as if it were trying to take flight. G.I.G.A.N began to unleash round after round of electromagnetic projectiles at the downed moth. Macy was surprised to see that none of the rounds hit the mark, instead exploding upon contact with an odd golden sheet of dust that now surrounded the new creature. G.I.G.A.N roared in frustration as it began to charge at the giant insect when Macy saw its wings begin to glow, their luminosity growing with intensity with each passing moment. It was too difficult for Macy to look directly at the creature, but she did notice Godzilla's tail began to lift itself off the ground. G.I.G.A.N shrieked in pain as it turned away from the bright light. Macy watched as the creature launched itself at the cyborg as it simultaneously turned and fired another electromagnetic round, this time finding its mark. The light quickly faded as Macy watched the now headless moth slam into G.I.G.A.N, knocking it over onto its back. "Serves you right for meddling, you wicked beast," Ian said with a hateful look on his face. Titanus Mothra, as referred to by Monarch Sciences, or simply Mothra, is its designation. Monarch found the existence of the creature back in 2009, but they had only found a chrysalis. They referred to it as the Queen of Monsters. Apparently, she was seen as some sort of divine being. Not so divine with your head missing, are you? Mothra, eh? So there really are more out there. G.I.G.A.N roared as it shook its head, still disoriented from Mothra's last attack. It stumbled in circles as it tried to swipe at the air, hoping to hit its already dead opponent. The cyborg abruptly stopped when it heard the all-too-familiar sound of the beast it had already beaten. Macy watched Godzilla throw its full weight into G.I.G.A.N, nothing left but scars where its lethal wounds used to be. The godly beast clamped down on G.I.G.A.N's throat as it pulled the abomination to the ground on top of Mothra's limp body. Macy could see Godzilla's spines glowing brighter than she had ever seen them before as it released a massive atomic beam that encompassed G.I.G.A.N's entire head. The beam's wide angle had also made contact with Mothra, setting the Queen of the Monsters on fire, which quickly consumed its entire body. Godzilla slammed its foot down on the lifeless cyborg and let out a fierce, triumphant roar that shook the buildings around him. So tell me, who are you? Macy turned her attention from the battlefield as Godzilla disappeared into the night, leaving the still burning bodies of the other Titans in its wake. She looked at Ian with a smile. I told you, my name is Macy. Don't insult my intelligence. You knew about Project G.I.G.A.N, and you're obviously not some mercenary. And why are your eyes glowing? My eyes are glowing? Ian looked at her with a sarcastic expression on his face. You're serious? Well then, Nima, Macy said aloud. Ian looked at her with one eyebrow raised. Then, as if appearing out of thin air, the figure of a tall, slender woman appeared. Ian noticed that she was dressed in a toga-like garment with golden trim. He was taken back by her beauty as a voice filled his mind. Hello again, Dr. Jensen. Do you have another query? In fact, I do, Nima. Can you tell me, are my eyes glowing? Yes. Can you tell me why? Ian's eyes grew wide as his mind began to flood with questions. Who was this woman that appeared out of nowhere, and how was he hearing her? Her lips were clearly not moving. It is a side effect of prolonged exposure to the cephalon. You might also have noticed that your eyes in the physical realm have exhibited the same symptoms. Well, my eyes aren't glowing yet, but their color has changed now that I think about it. Tell me, is it dangerous? Nima smiled at Macy. I do not hold any record of cephalon exposure within my databanks. I cannot accurately inform you of its full range of side effects at this time. Apologies, Dr. Jensen. What the hell's going on here? Who is this woman, and what the hell's a cephalon? Macy turned to face Ian as she attempted to ease his anxiety with a smile. Nothing you will remember. Ian watched as the memory began to fade into darkness, quickly making its way to the outpost he was lingering on with Macy and their new companion. His heart began to race as his body began to dissipate into nothing as the darkness overtook him. Suddenly, he found himself looking up at an unfamiliar ceiling. Then he saw the face of a woman appear above him. Are you okay? Ian looked into the woman's eyes that were a beautiful shade of blue. Realizing he was lying on a bed, he sat up and took a quick look around his hotel room. Something seemed a little off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Who are you? My name is Macy. I was coming back up to get my luggage when I found you on the ground outside your door. You were still breathing, so I took your key card from your pocket and pulled you in here. What happened to you? Ian placed his hand on his head that had started aching when he sat up. I don't know. I guess I blacked out or something? This has never happened to me before. Well, you seem like you're doing better. Maybe you should get yourself checked out. And maybe lay off the fast food. You were kind of heavy. The pair shared a moment of laughter when Macy got up and made her way to the door. Well, thanks for your help. But where are you going? Macy opened the door and turned to face the still disoriented man still sitting on his bed. I've got a flight to catch. I'm already running late. Goodbye, Ian. It was nice meeting you. I hope you get better soon. And with that, she disappeared behind the now closed hotel room door. Ian took a sigh of relief when a thought came to his mind. He looked around the room, searching for his wallet. He stood up, realizing that it was still in his back pocket. He scanned the room one more time, searching for the answer to the question that plagued his mind. How did she know my name?